why he thinks the way he does, why you think the way you do, and it forces us to really consider and defend our beliefs. Also, one thing you can say about him is he argues very clearly and simply. Some people say too simply, but I thought it'd be a nice sort of change of pace after we went through Thomas Aquinas, who I know doesn't argue quite so simply, and was probably a little tiring to get through. But yeah, as you saw in the pre-reading, one criticism that professional philosophers make of him is that he has this one idea, which is, utilitarianism, which is preferential utilitarianism, which isn't even original to him, and that's sort of what he bases everything on. And people say, well, it's so simple. Can he really even be a philosopher if his arguments are that, uncomplicated? We'll see. All right. And yeah, he has pretty radical views: vegetarianism, animal rights, charity, all that stuff. Okay, so biography on Mr. Singer, or Professor Singer. So Peter Singer's parents were Jews from Vienna who immigrated after Hitler annexed Vienna in 1938. If you guys know your Western history, that's sort of the start of World War II, the Second World War, which, Hitler thought that Jews were the source of all evil in the world. He was not a big fan of them. So, Peter Singer's parents made it out okay into Australia. His relatives and his parents' friends and whatever did not. 130,000 Jews were forced from Austria by 1941. Their property was confiscated, and they had to pay a tax. So all the Jews who didn't leave Austria before 1941 sort of left Austria with absolutely nothing. And then the Jews that remained, who, for whatever reason didn't want to leave Austria, were sent to concentration camps where they were rounded up, forced to work, and eventually killed. And only 2,000 Jews survived the war in Austria. This is a picture from Liberation of one of the Austrian concentration camps. You can see that disabled. It was pretty horrific, and it's actually, if you go to a country like Austria, even though they've since apologized and done everything they can to make up for it, it's sort of left this huge impact on the Jews that live there, and they're still somewhat in hiding, and they've their synagogues, their places of worship, they're hidden. And you have to imagine that, for Peter Singer's parents, and therefore Peter Singer, it had to leave an impact on them as well. If everyone you grew up with, if everyone you were friends with sort of went through this horrible event where all their neighbors turned on them, you'd think it would sort of leave an impact on you. So that was his parents. Peter Singer just grew up in Australia. Pretty normal life. He graduated from Oxford in 1971 with an essay on civil disobedience. So when it's right to disobey the laws and how one should do so. He became a professor at Princeton in 1999. And one thing that might not surprise you is the way he became famous was he published this book, which we'll talk about a bit, called Practical Ethics, where he outlined his radical views on vegetarianism, animal rights, and the rights of the disabled. And when he gave lectures about it in Germany, people protested, and they wouldn't let him speak and whatever. And of course, ironically, their plan was to make him sort of an outcast and make it impossible for him to do anything. And instead, they made him famous. And speaking of other reasons why, a lot of contemporary philosophers don't like Peter Singer, I think there's sort of the idea that, like, he became famous and he got this professorship through a different game than the rest of them were playing. They're all carefully arguing and, researching and whatever and publishing in their own journals, and, the public really doesn't know them that well. And meanwhile, Peter Singer comes along and he says these really inflammatory things. He gets people outraged and protesting, and that makes him so famous because, the newspapers cover it, that eventually he, gets these professorships and becomes probably the most famous living philosopher in the world. You can understand how that would sort of anger them, that he wasn't playing the same game that they were. But, all right, let's talk about some historical background of Peter Singer, how he became who he became, how he ended up with these very radical views. So he came of age, he became an adult in the 60s and 70s. He graduates with his master's in 1971 from Oxford. And these were very crazy periods in the Western world. Of course, they were crazy periods in China as well. And believe it or not, Mao's teachings were discussed and argued about in America and in the rest of the West. But that was sort of alongside everything else that was happening, which is a huge number of protests. There was this sense that the historical order was breaking down, that, they said forever, I think it was really this sort of order that's been established maybe since the late 19th century of, parents and their kids, and this, control and ways of thinking that your parents tell you to. It breaks down. Students are rebelling, they're protesting, they're shutting down college campuses, they're attacking political leaders, and in a lot of ways people felt like it was the start of something completely new. Like all the old beliefs were gone, and now it was time for something new. It didn't quite turn out that way. Things never changed as much as young people expect them to. But it did leave a big impact on people who went through it. And I think we should understand Peter Singer in light of the, all the old ideas being thrown out and him being the start of these, new crazy ideas. So specifically what we're going to look at is period late 60s, early 70s. This is when Peter Singer's received his bachelor's in Australia, his master's in Australia, and his master's in Britain. And actually, in just these, 4 or 5 years, a huge amount happened. So, first things first. What was the, big geopolitical event of the 60s? Well, for the West, it was the Vietnam War. This was, of course, the U.S. Stepping in to stop North Vietnam from establishing communism in South Vietnam. They step in after the French leave, and technically it started in 1955 with the U.S., but it really started to escalate in the 60s as a president named Lyndon Johnson sort of took control of it after John F. Kennedy died, and he really stepped it up. At first it was a popular war. There was this sense of, communism is evil. Communism is the opposite of freedom. Let's support freedom. And then it changed. It went on and went on and went on. It never seemed to end. The war actually ends in 20 years after it began, so it was a long war. It seemed pointless, once it became clear that the South Vietnamese weren't as pro-freedom and anti-communist as the U.S. government had, sort of claimed. And the biggest thing is that there was a draft. There was a draft of Australians starting in 1965 and a draft of Americans starting in 1969. And that sort of made the whole thing a lot more unpopular. Once, the young men start actually getting sent over there to Vietnam and forced to fight, people start really questioning, what's the point? And so this picture here says, resist the draft, don't register. So that was a pretty common thing, is people either not registering for the draft or fleeing to Canada. Recently, there was a boxer who died, a couple months ago, or not a couple months ago, maybe a month ago. Muhammad Ali died, who was, regarded as by the greatest boxer of all time. And he became famous in the 60s by refusing to fight in Vietnam. That was just one of the people who sort of really publicly took a stance and said, no, I'm not going over there. I'm not killing people. I'm not dying for this. And you should notice here, so this person in the middle, that's not a girl, that's a guy with the long hair. And you can see this guy, long hair, beard. So all of these people, they're dressing in this way. It's rebellion against their parents, right? Their parents would be sort of outraged, and they'd say, you have to cut your hair, you have to shave your face, look like an adult, look like a man. And they'd say, no, I won't. I'm going to wear my hair how I want. I'm going to have a beard if I want to. Yeah. So, but let's talk about Britain, which is where Peter Singer was. So as part of these protests against the Vietnam War, the British were involved in supporting America. British students actually attacked the British Defense Secretary and the Secretary of State in a riot. So, in terms of the historical order breaking down, that's pretty extreme, right? They were physically beaten. August 1968, riots break out in America during the Democratic National Convention, which is the big convention of one of the two main political parties of the U.S. And the Democrats, who were responsible for the war, lose the election, which ends the control that Democrats had over the U.S. government for the past 30 years or so. And by the way, if you guys ever study modern American history, 1968, that summer is called the Long Hot Summer. The reason it's called the Long Hot Summer is because during that time, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., so sort of who we'll cover in a second, gets assassinated. John F. Kennedy was already assassinated. His brother gets assassinated, and people just go nuts. Buildings are burned, police cars are burned, there are riots in the streets, they're looting. And 1968 is a pretty crazy year in a lot of ways. All right. So, civil rights protests. Ethnic minorities all over the world, Britain, Australia, America, protest for their rights with mixed results. We'll take it country by country. Also, I really hope you guys like this GIF. I had to sort of work really hard to get it to work in my PowerPoint. And hopefully you recognize this. This is The Simpsons, and these are hippies. So these guys, hippies, shooting flowers. And you can see he's a hippie. He's shirtless. He has long hair and a beard. And they're shooting flowers because that was a symbol of the hippies. All right. So, first of all, civil rights. Let's talk about Britain. So British civil rights were focused around the protests by Catholics. So I'm not sure if you guys know this, but Ireland has historically been divided up into its own country, which is called the Republic of Ireland, which is in the south. And then Northern Ireland is controlled by Britain. So with the Brexit vote, which hopefully you guys saw in the newspaper, Northern Ireland, still part of Britain, no longer part of the EU. And Ireland has been, historically it's been pretty oppressed. The British have spent about 1,000 years, more or less, subjugating the Irish in some form or another, killing them in some form or another, causing famines. So in Northern Ireland, which is, region of Ireland still controlled by the British in the 60s, the Catholics, who is that's sort of the native religion, I'd say, of the Irish, and meanwhile Protestantism is like the native religion of the British. So the Catholics in Northern Ireland, they weren't allowed a lot of rights, like they weren't really allowed to vote, and there were restrictions on owning land and employment and stuff like that. They start a civil rights movement. The Protestant majority in Britain and in Northern Ireland resists. And so the Catholics start a campaign of nonviolent resistance. Unlike what happens in America, the nonviolent resistance becomes violent once they experience pushback from the British police. And specifically, there's a terrorist group, protest group, sort of depends on who you talk to, called the IRA, who are, representing the Northern Irish, who protest, and they turn violent, and there are bombs and assassinations and stuff like that. And the violence and strife actually continues until the 1990s, even into England itself, until eventually it ends. And this is a picture of a British policeman, dragging a Northern Irish protester by his hair. And by the way, this might be surprising to you because Ireland, you think of it now, it's modern, it's technologically advanced. That's, in a lot of ways, that surprises the Irish as much as it does anyone, because, you can talk to people my age or your own age who are Irish, and they can tell you they very clearly remember, these are called the Troubles. They remember the Troubles, and there are still a lot of ethnic tensions in Ireland, although they're a lot better than they were, of like places where if you were Protestant, you couldn't go here, or if you were Catholic, you couldn't go here. And if you did go there, then at best you'd get beat up. So it's pretty astonishing, actually, how well Ireland has done since, say, the mid-1990s. Surprising pretty much everyone. But let's talk about other people. 60s are a crazy time, as I told you, civil rights. So Peter Singer, he's spending most of the 60s in Australia, so of course he's coming in contact with the Aborigines. So the Aborigines are the original people of Australia, Australia. They were there, when the British came and established Australia as a penal colony, which means when starting in about the 1700s, when people were declared criminals in Britain, they were literally put on a boat and sent to Australia and forced to work as slave labor there. It's a really weird and fascinating system, and I'd love to talk about it more because, for one thing, the historical background is crazy, right? There's someone doing something wrong in your country, which the British, by the way, in the 1700s, that included things like stealing a loaf of bread if you were starving. And then they'd be like, okay, well, it's off to what they would call the continent with you, which means they'd put them on a boat and they'd send them to Australia. And there would be 10-year-old British kids. They've never been on a boat before, and all of a sudden they're halfway around the world. But as you might imagine, the British were not particularly nice to the Aborigines. In fact, they were downright horrible, and didn't grant them the right to vote, own land, work. It was pretty bad. They're granted the vote in 1962. They're granted full citizenship in 1967. Before that, they did not have that. Something that's really crazy is they're not granted the right to their own money until 1972. There actually had to be a case in the Australian Supreme Court where an Aborigine guy who, had a job and all of his money from his job had been taken by the government and it would give out to him as an allowance when he needed things. He had to prove in court that he understood the concept of money, which, if that's not racist, I don't know what is racist. That's really racist to be like, oh, we have to take all your money. There's no way you can understand how to use money. He proved that he understood what money was, and then finally Aborigines were granted the right to their own money in 1972. In contrast to what happened in Britain and Ireland, although there were protests, Aborigines were granted their rights without any major violence or major resistance. That included what was called the Freedom Bus, which was a bus of students that went around trying to gather support for Aborigine civil rights. All right. By the way, in case you guys are wondering, you're like, why are there so many things in which Britain seems to show up and cause problems? This is a map of the countries Britain has invaded, I found online. They have invaded every country in the world except for 22. So the countries in white are the ones they haven't invaded over history. The countries in pink are the ones that are. So you notice most of America, a lot of Africa, almost all of Europe, almost all of Asia. The British have, although very polite, historically have been sort of not great people. Not great people. They've spent a lot of time going into other countries and doing bad things to them. So, not sure what to say about that. But let's talk about another former British colony, America. So the American Civil Rights Movement during the 1960s was focused around equal rights for Black Americans, or African Americans, as they're sometimes called. Civil rights movement is very complicated and bloody, and it sort of starts with the fact that America was founded on slave labor, so they would bring over Africans as slaves, and that was Africans and Black people being slaves was ended in the mid-19th century, so in the 1860s. But there is still this system of subjugation and discrimination for the next about 100 years, and that was finally declared illegal in the 60s. So they were given full citizenship in 1964 and were guaranteed equal housing and protection from violence in 1968. And, the sort of system of discrimination, whatever, in some ways continues on today. And you'll see that in the news sometime of how, there are equal rights is the complicated thing. And there's a lot of arguments about it. It was a lot better than what it was. What it was back in the 60s was immensely violent. So in terms of what was happening in the 60s in America, the leaders of civil rights, so here's the civil rights protest in America. You see, a bunch of young black guys sort of demanding equal rights. So the two biggest leaders of the movement, both assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. A president was assassinated. His brother was assassinated. Riots swept the streets. It's pretty insane. And in terms of other people who were assassinated for, black rights, if you go, again, back to the 1860s, the president who ended slavery, Abraham Lincoln, was also assassinated. So there have only been like 4 or 5 presidents who've been assassinated throughout America's history, and 2 of those have been over issues of civil rights and equal rights for black people. It's been a complicated topic, and again, it's something I really wish I could talk more about. And finally, I don't want to go too much into this, especially because I think of everything that's probably didn't have a huge impact on Peter Singer, because he doesn't seem to reference this much. There are also global protests for equal rights for women during this time. Women had gained the right to vote most of the world, but this was right to have a job, to have abortions, and to live independently and sort of have the same rights as men. Here we have women demand equality. Not a super well put together sign. They seem to have ran out of room. But and meanwhile, we have a black woman here saying, "I'm a second-class citizen," which is interesting. The intersection between the civil rights protests and the feminist protests were complicated. But, and something that is interesting is during this time, there is such a thing that develops called feminist philosophy. While that is actually still a department in a lot of American universities, there's not sort of the encounters I've had with it. I haven't been too impressed about the scholarship and whatever, so I haven't included any of that in the lesson plans. But that is a thing that exists, feminist philosophy, because, philosophy is mostly men, and this is supposedly philosophy that's for women. Anyways, all right. But on to Peter Singer. Why did we talk about all those protests? Historical background. Well, understand this guy who is super controversial and focuses a lot of his time and efforts on overthrowing the old systems and starting something new and radically different. So his basic belief isn't that radical. He's fundamentally a utilitarian, which means this philosophy started in the 19th century, which we'll go over the founding of in another class. But it essentially means ethics should be about measuring and maximizing happiness. Peter Singer's specific point of view is that ethics should be about maximizing people's preferences instead of just people's happiness. But, that's sort of a detail. His main thing is coming directly from the 19th century. All right, and here we have a comic at the bottom, Calvin and Hobbes, famous American comic. I thought it showed the ideals of utilitarianism well. We have Mo, the bully, says, "I want that truck." And Calvin says, "It's mine. I brought it from home." Mo says, "I said, give me the truck." Calvin says, "You can't just take things from people because you're bigger." And Mo says, "I'm not taking it. You're giving it to me because we'll both be so much happier that way." Calvin says, "How touching." So you see, Mo is a utilitarian. He's trying to maximize everyone's happiness. If Calvin hadn't given him the truck, then Mo would have hit him, and then they both would have been unhappy. Mo wouldn't have had the truck, and Calvin wouldn't have had would have been punched. Meanwhile, Calvin gives the truck. He's slightly sadder because he no longer has the truck, but he also hasn't been hit, so they're both happier. All right. So, finally, we're done with all the background. Let's talk about Peter Singer. Why is he so controversial? Well, I'm going to go over his beliefs. His main book is this book called Practical Ethics. It's first published in 1979 and then updated and updated and updated. And you guys can see whether you get the point where you can really trace why exactly he's considered so radical, why I felt the need to mention the very crazy time he was, the 1960s, he was coming of age among protests, Vietnam War protests, civil rights protests. All right, let's just read his beliefs. All ethics need to be taken from the point of view of an omniscient spectator trying to maximize global happiness. So Peter Singer, he's not a religious guy, but he's saying, if you're trying to decide what you should do, what you really need to do is not think about yourself, but think of it as if you were a guy up in the sky and you were looking down and you're trying to maximize global happiness. So happiness for everyone around the world. Trying to make it as great as possible. It says, if you were this guy looking down from, the clouds, how would you do that? And he says, well, the way you do that is you try to maximize the preferences of everybody involved. So, if someone wants to become a doctor, you let them become a doctor. If someone wants to eat candy, you give them candy. If someone wants to, spend their entire day sleeping, you give them a bed and they can sleep. And that would make everyone as happy as possible. So, okay, sounds reasonable so far, right? And then that's what ethics should be. If you're wondering what the best thing to do would be, if you saw a guy who wanted to become a doctor, you would try to help him any way you could to help him become a doctor. If you met someone who wanted candy, you would do everything you could to give them candy. Okay. Says all humans should be considered equally. Still seems to mostly make sense, right? Saying, you can't just be considering one person at a time. Think of everyone. Think of every person. Don't give all your money to the guy who wants to become a doctor for medical school, and then you have no money to, say, buy food for someone who's hungry. Then he gets a little stranger. He says, all sentient animals should be considered equally, including humans. So here he gets a little off the rails. He says, well, all humans should be considered equal. Well, what do we mean by that? We mean everybody who thinks. We mean everybody who wants something. Well, who else wants things? Well, animals do. Dogs want things. Dogs want to eat food, go on walks, whatever. So when you're trying to, figure out what you should do based on maximizing everyone's preferences, well, then you should also consider about the dogs and the squirrels and everyone else. And that should be part of how you're, thinking about things. So you should think, yeah, if I give all my money to the guy who wants to become a doctor, then I wouldn't necessarily have money to buy dog food, and then my dog would be unhappy because he'd be hungry. That's a little strange. All right. It is wrong to kill anyone or anything with those rights because that would decrease global happiness. Okay. Little stranger. His argument here is everything wants to live. Nothing wants to die. So in terms of preferences of people involved, you can't kill anything that wants to die, that doesn't want to die. So for instance, you can't kill a cow because a cow doesn't want to die. A cow wants to live, and a cow wants to sort of have calves and whatever. So that's where he gets vegetarianism from. Then he says, this is where the protests start. This is where people really start having problems. He says, well, what about things that don't care whether they live or die? Well, then it's fine to kill them. If it would increase global happiness, then sure. And for instance, he says, when a baby is so young that they don't really have preferences, and you think of like, if you've ever, been around a baby of like 2 weeks or something, they really don't have much to care about, right? And it's hard to say how much they notice the outside world. They just sort of roll around and cry and whatever, but they don't really think in the way normal people do. So he says, yeah, what would be wrong with killing like a very newborn baby? They obviously don't have strong preferences. And he says, same thing with the severely disabled. Like, say, if there was a person who was so disabled that they couldn't do anything by themselves, and their, parents or whatever had to take care of them, then if it would make their parents happier for them to die, then their parents should be allowed to kill them. So, yeah. Anyways, so then it's not wrong to help anyone in need, even if it is wrong to not help anyone in need, even if they have no connection to you. Again, not so crazy. And finally, he says being moral is rational. So this isn't only a thing you should do. This is a thing if you're smart. You'll do all of this just because that's the smartest thing to do, not just because that's the thing you should do. So, this is his philosophy. It's not super complicated. It's easy to understand. But, as you can tell, it's the sort of thing that demands a response, right? Especially once you get down to killing newborns. He believes this. I'm not sure if I do. But you certainly think, where exactly does this chain of argument go wrong? Because when you get to here, it does seem logical. It just seems really, really abhorrent, right? It seems bad. Well, let's keep that in mind. So how does Peter Singer come up with this stuff? Well, let's talk about the background to his philosophy. So Peter Singer's mentor at Oxford was this guy named R.M. Hare, who was not a controversial figure. He had two main ideas. His first idea was universal prescriptivism, which means when we say moral statements, we mean them as should statements, not statements of truth or statements of feeling. So he says, for example, when we say suicide is bad, we don't mean we can prove suicide is bad. We don't mean I feel like suicide is bad. We mean don't commit suicide. If we say it's bad to steal candy from babies, again, we don't mean we can prove that in a logical argument. We mean don't do that. So this sort of argument is not particularly interesting if you think about it as that's actually what everyone literally means. Because then, the way you disprove it would just be someone being like, well, when I say it, I actually mean that I can prove that suicide is bad, or I can prove that taking candy from babies is bad. And then you get in a really stupid argument. But if you think about it, if you take it as this is what moral statements should be, if you think about it, when you say suicide is bad, you should be saying that don't commit suicide. Or in the case of Peter Singer, when you say something is bad, you say that's what you should be doing. Then it gets more interesting because it makes ethics not just this philosophy that people talk about at Oxford, but guidelines for how you should actually be acting, which is how Peter Singer takes it. He says this is what you actually should be doing. Like, I'm not presenting this as an argument. I'm saying this is what you should be doing. This is how you should live your life. All right. So, preference utilitarianism. This other main idea. And we already went over, instead of maximizing happiness, so saying, I know what would make you happy, instead you just say, you know what would make you happy, I'll just try to make you, allow you to do whatever would make you happy. Like, if you think that it would make you happy to eat candy all day, then you should eat candy all day. I'll try to make it so you can eat candy all day. Maybe you'll get fat. Maybe you'll get a stomach ache. Maybe you'll develop rotten teeth. But that's your business. It's not my job to tell you how you should live your life. So, these are R.M. Hare's ideas. And that's pretty much how Peter Singer gets his ideas. So, let's, first of all, how are people doing? Does it make sense so far? I understand, definitely controversial. Everything makes sense. Ni明白了吗? All right. Awesome. So, let's talk about let's talk about the reading that I assigned, which is this very famous essay called Famine, Affluence, and Morality that Peter Singer publishes in 1973. And it quickly becomes sort of one of the most famous works of ethics written in the 20th century. So, by the way, in terms of words, famine, not having enough to eat, right? Like a country starving. Affluence, how rich people are. Morality, goodness, what you should be doing. So, some background. In 1971, and again, remember, this is when Peter Singer is graduating Oxford, Pakistan is divided up into two countries. So you get Pakistan, India, East Pakistan. So East Pakistan is pretty complicated. The majority in East Pakistan are Bengalis. And Bengalis don't believe the same things as the people in West Pakistan. Bengalis tend to be Hindu, and they also have different ethnicity and whatever. And you can understand by 1971, they're like, we have nothing in common with the people who are actually ruling Pakistan. So we want independence. West Pakistan does not take kindly to this. They invade their own country. They kill 3 million people, and they displace 30 million people. So 30 million people have to run away from their homes, And a lot of these people flee into India, into the state called Bengal, because that's where most Bengalis in India live, Bengal. And that strains, the state of Bengal is already poor. India itself is poor. There's not many resources. And so that strains their resources. And there's a lot of starvation and disease and whatever, everything you'd expect. Here we have Bengali soldiers marching off to war. You can see they're basically kids, right? They're like maybe 17, 18. And these are their army uniforms. It's not, they're actually barefoot. It's not an impressive army. So, by the way, something else that Pakistan does that's sort of unforgivable and has this big impact on East Pakistan, which eventually becomes Bangladesh, is they round up all the intellectuals and they actually kill them. So every professor, every mathematician, every doctor, everything, West Pakistan kills them. And as you imagine, even today, it's had a huge impact on Bangladesh. When you think that like everyone who should have been there to like lead the new state, to teach people whatever, were dead, it's a pretty unforgivable thing in my imagination. But neither here nor there. So Western nations don't do much when West Pakistan invades East Pakistan. They sort of help a bit, but there's a very complicated system of alliances between Western nations, Pakistan, the Soviet Union, and Pakistan's historic enemy, India. And India and Pakistan hate each other, and then the West mostly supports Pakistan, and Soviet Union mostly supports India, although, again, it's very complicated, especially because the governments of both countries sort of can't always decide what side they support or what they really believe in. But so the West doesn't do much, and instead India intervenes. They invade East Pakistan, kick out West Pakistan from East Pakistan, and Bangladesh becomes an independent state. If this seems complicated to you or confusing, that's because it is. It's complicated when, for example, Pakistan makes a country out of people who, first of all, don't really, aren't really the same as them. Second of all, are actually separated by them by all of India. And the whole thing is super crazy, complicated. But the important thing is you end up with a lot of Bengalis starving in India and in East Pakistan. So why does this matter? Well, because to Peter Singer, this is an emergency, right? He says people are starving. He says there's not only are people starving, but why is no one helping? People, both individually and as a group, so you donating individually or whole governments or whole organizations, they haven't done that much, even though they could. So he says Britain, for instance, has given rather more than most countries. It has to date given £14,750,000. They say, for comparative purposes, Britain's share of the non-recoverable development costs, the Anglo-French Concord project, is already in excess of £275 million, and on present estimates will reach £440 million. The implication is that the British government values the supersonic transport more than 30 times as highly as it values the lives of the 9 million refugees. So the calculation here is super simple. Peter Singer just says, look, Britain, which has actually done more than most countries, they've given 15 million to this, but in trying to develop the Concorde, and the Concorde was this super fast plane which would fly between Britain and France, and also between New York and France. It was it was actually pretty cool, and like you could fly from America to Europe in like 3 hours, which is like 3 times as fast as you can now. But not enough people were actually willing to pay the money to fly in it, so it was eventually discontinued. But Britain says, Peter Singer says, Britain spent £440 million on a super fast plane and £15 million on saving the lives of starving people. So he says, therefore, Britain values a super fast plane more than 30 times as much as it values the lives of the 9 million refugees. And he says, this means that Western countries have left this burden entirely to India. They're saying it's India's problem, they're in your country, you deal with it. And Peter Singer says, this is my main example to argue that our moral conceptual scheme needs to be altered. Here he means the way we think about morals, we need to change it. There's something very wrong. So why does he say that? Well, he says, listen, he just has two real points. His first point is, I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Okay, that makes sense. It's bad. It's bad for people to die if they don't have food or shelter. He also says, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. He says, all right, if we can do something, if we can prevent something bad from happening, we should do it. And he says, without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, I mean without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, or doing something that is wrong in itself, failing to promote some moral good, comparable in significance to the bad thing that we can prevent. Right? He's saying, if we can do something bad, or if we can prevent something bad from happening without causing something else bad to happen, then yeah, prevent the bad thing from happening. Seems straightforward enough. Seems easy. No one's going to argue with that. But he says, the uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated is deceptive. So he knows it looks like it's not, there's nothing wrong with it, but he says it's deceptive. You don't realize that it's more controversial than it appears. If it were acted upon, even if it in its qualified form, our lives, our society, and our world would be fundamentally changed. So everything changes if we think about this as the guiding moral principle. It makes, for the principle, takes, firstly, no account of proximity or distance. It doesn't matter how near or far away someone is. It makes no moral difference whether the person I can help is a neighbor's child, 10 yards from me, so my neighbor, or a Bengali whose name I shall never know, 10,000 miles away. It doesn't matter if they're next to me or if they're 10,000 miles away. Secondly, the principle makes no distinction between cases in which I'm the only person who could possibly do anything and cases in which I am just one among millions and sorry, it cuts off here. It says among millions in the same position. So it doesn't matter whether they're near or far, and it doesn't matter whether I'm the only one who can do something or if everyone else could do something and I'm just one of everyone else. Right? By the way, speaking of Bengali children, I know they don't mention Bengali children directly, but I looked up Bengali children on the internet and I got this really cute kid. I don't know what any of these stuff mean. I would guess it's a religious ceremony of some sort. Maybe you guys know. But I did think it was a really cute kid. Okay. So, why shouldn't distance make a difference? Like, why does it not matter whether it's someone right next to us who's starving or someone 10,000 miles away who's starving? Well, he says, expert observers and supervisors sent out by famine relief organizations or permanently stationed in famine-prone areas can direct our aid to a refugee in Bengal almost as effectively as we could get it to someone in our own block. So he says, well, it should make a difference, Because obviously they're both people, right? They're people whether they're 10,000 miles away, or they're people whether they're right next to you. They're people whether you don't know them, or people whether you know them. So it really shouldn't make a difference, like, how far away they are. And he says, if you're thinking, well, I can't do anything to help people who are 10,000 miles away, he says that's not true. They're expert observers, they're supervisors. There are all these experts whose whole job is to make it so you can easily help people 10,000 miles away. So you shouldn't try to argue that you can't just because you're not sure if it would help. Like, that's not why you're not helping. Okay, so let's say we buy that. What other objections might we bring up? Saying, well, what if we just say, well, why should we help? Why don't other people have to help? Well, why can't the Bengalis help themselves? Why can't Indians help them? Like, why does it have to be us Americans? He says, the view that numbers do make a difference can be made plausible if stated in this way. If everyone in circumstances like mine gave £5 to the Bengal Relief Fund, there would be enough to provide food, shelter, and medical care for the refugees. There is no reason why I should give more than anyone else in the same circumstances as I am. Therefore, I have no obligation to give more than £5. So he says, listen, sure, I'll give £5. That's a nice thing to do. But, why should I have to do as much as I can? Why should I have to give all the money that I can? Because, I know that if just everyone gives £5, then that'd be fine. So why would I give £1,000? And he says, well, each premise in this argument is true, and the argument looks sound. Okay, if each person gives £5, then that'd be enough. But we have to notice that it is based on a hypothetical premise, although the conclusion is not stated hypothetically. He's saying this is based on something that's not true, that we don't know whether it's true, even though we say the conclusion not hypothetically. We say the premise, we don't know whether it's true, and then we say the conclusion, we definitely know it's true. There's something wrong. It says the argument would be sound if the conclusion were, if everyone in circumstances like mine were to give £5, I would have no obligation to give more than £5. There we are, right? If the conclusions were so stated, however, it would be obvious that the argument has no bearing on a situation in which it was not the case that everyone else gives £5. So he says, yeah, we can only give £5 and be like, it'll be fine if we know that everyone else is giving £5. But it is more or less certain that not everyone in circumstances like mine will give £5. Says you can only justify, giving £5 and forgetting about it if you're positive that everyone else is going to give £5. But you know that's not true. You know probably not everyone's going to give £5. You know there probably won't be enough to provide the needed food, shelter, and medical care. So you know that if you want to prevent as much suffering as possible, you need to give more than £5. But then what happens if everyone thinks that and we give way too much money, and then we're all poor and the Bengalis don't know what to do with all the money that they have? And he says, well, okay, fine, that might happen. Unlikely, but it might happen. But still, the result of everyone doing what he really ought to do cannot be worse than the result of everyone doing less than he ought to do, although the result of everyone doing what he reasonably believes he ought to do could be. A little complicated, but he's saying it can't be worse for everyone to give as much as possible, than it is for everyone to do, not as much as possible. Because he's saying, worst comes to worst, they just have too much money. That's a lot better than them starving. And, maybe it would be better if they had exactly the right amount of money, but that shouldn't be something we're that concerned about. All right. So this is Peter Singer saying, give all the money you possibly can to the Bengalis for their famine. pretty extreme argument, isn't it? Well, let's see. What are these implications? Well, for one thing, he says, if you buy things for yourself instead of spending money on the poor, you're doing something wrong. He says, when we buy new clothes, not to keep ourselves warm, but to look well-dressed, we are not providing for any important need. We would not be sacrificing anything significant if we were to continue to wear our old clothes and give the money to famine relief. By doing so, we would be preventing another person from starving. It follows from what I have said earlier that we ought to give money away rather than spend it on clothes which we do not need to keep us warm. To do so is not charitable or generous. So he's saying it's not charity to give money away instead of spending it on new clothes. He's saying it's not generous to give money away rather than spend it on new clothes. He's saying, nor is it the kind of act which philosophers and theologians have called supererogatory. That's a philosophical term. You don't need to know it right now. But he says, it's an act which would be good to do, but not wrong not to do. So he's saying, like, it's not something that you can say, well, if you do it, you're a good person, but if you don't do it, you're not a bad person. No, he says, we ought to give the money away, and it is wrong not to do so. So, he's saying, don't buy yourself any new clothes. Give all the money to famine relief. If you don't do that, you're a bad person. It's an extreme argument. It really is. He's basically arguing here, you can't ever spend money on yourself as long as there are people starving in the world. You need to basically provide for the bare minimum. Keep yourself with clothes, with enough food to live on, but don't buy yourself fancy clothes. Don't buy yourself fancy food. Don't buy yourself a new TV as long as there are people who need it more than you do. And here says, this is a charity box of the sort you might have seen before. It says, please give what you can. And according to Peter Singer, he means that literally. He means give until it hurts. All right. So what if you say, well, I mean, I think I agree with you, but like no one really acts like this. Peter Singer says, well, listen, I did not set out to present a morally neutral description of the way people make their moral judgments. The way people do in fact judge has nothing to do with the validity of my conclusion. Basically, I'm not trying to say the way people actually make moral decisions. I'm saying the way you should be making moral decisions. He says, my conclusion follows from the principle which I advanced earlier, and unless that principle is rejected, with the argument shown to be unsound, I think the conclusion must stand, however strange it appears. And he says, yeah, it might look crazy. You might disagree with me, but unless you can prove me wrong, you have to do it. I don't care what you actually have been doing before this. That's not my problem. My problem is what you should be doing now. Here we have a judge giving a thumbs down. I assume this isn't a real judge. It's probably a real judge probably wouldn't look like this. But this is Peter Singer saying, I don't care. All right. Saying, well, okay, but if we're telling people to do things that they wouldn't do, then isn't that bad? And he's saying the way he describes it is if we tell people not to murder and to give everything they can to famine relief, they will do neither. Saying if we have this moral code in which we tell people to do things that they won't do, then it will be very hard to get them to do anything. You know, if we're saying it's bad to it's bad to buy new clothes, and it's bad to murder people, they're going to buy new clothes, and then they're going to be like, well, why shouldn't I murder people as well? Obviously, there's nothing wrong with buying new clothes, so might as well kill someone. He says, well, come on. He says, in any case, the possibility that by spreading the idea, we ought to be doing very much more than we are to relieve famine, we shall bring about a general breakdown of moral behavior seems remote. He says that probably won't happen. I don't think there's a possibility that people will hear what I say, that you're a bad person if you buy new clothes, and they say, well, if I'm going to be a bad person anyways, might as well kill someone. He says, well, also, if the stakes are an end to widespread starvation, it's worth the risk. Yeah, sure. And finally, it should be emphasized that these considerations are relevant only to the issue of what we should require from others and not to what we ourselves ought to do. So he says, like, these considerations, like, you know, might we accidentally be encouraging murderers by doing this? It only matters when we're thinking about what we should tell other people. But when we're thinking about what we should tell ourselves, presumably we're not going to tell ourselves, like, yeah, I didn't, like, donate all I could to charity yesterday. It's fine. Might as well murder someone today. Like, we're probably not going to tell ourselves that. So why does that even matter? Like, that's not an important argument, according to Peter Singer. All right. And then Peter Singer says, well, you might think now, oh, doesn't this mean not only I can't buy new clothes, but it also means I have to, like, work way more than I do so I can get more money, give more to the poor. Like, it's not only a case of, like, giving up things that I want to buy, it's a case of giving up my time, too. Because, like, you know, whatever is going to happen, and I'm going to be like, I can't stand another hour at work. And then I'm going to think, well, it's probably better for me to spend another hour at work than for someone to die in Bengal, or someone to starve to death in Bengal. So I should just spend another hour at work. And it's just going to happen that I'm going to be working 20 hours a day, getting 4 hours of sleep. I'm going to be totally miserable just so I can save people in Bengal and make sure that they don't die. Peter Singer says, okay, yeah, that sounds good to me. You definitely should be spending way more time at work then. Make more money, send more money to the poor. By the way, do you guys like this double thumbs up guy? He's like super enthusiastic about this. This is what I sort of imagine Peter Singer thinking. Like, yeah, it is a good idea. Spend more time at work. Make more money. Give it all away. All right? So Peter Singer, he's now finished with this theoretical objections, right? He's saying, you have no more reasons to disagree with my arguments about what you should be doing. Now he's saying, what are the practical objections you might have? Well, he says, one practical objection you might have is the government's going to see all these people giving money to the poor, and they're going to be like, well, then we don't have to do that. And that would be bad because, you know, we just encourage the government to do bad things if we do good things. And Peter Singer's not quite buying that. He says, unless there are definite probability that by refusing to give one would be helping to bring about massive government assistance, people who do refuse to make voluntary contributions are refusing to prevent a certain amount of suffering without being able to point to any tangible beneficial consequences of their refusal. Says, yeah, this seems questionable. Unless I was sure that, you know, by giving, I would be preventing the government from giving. Like, it just seems like you're coming up with excuses now. Like, just saying that makes me think that you're just too lazy or too selfish to give money to the poor unless you can really prove it. And the other practical objection, and this is a very 70s one, by the way. At the time Peter Singer was writing this, there was a widespread belief started by this book called The Population Bomb, that pretty soon the population was going to grow out of control and there'd be widespread famine. And it sort of makes sense. You can see how people panic about that. You know, speaking of people panicking, you know, China's one-child policy. It's people were really worried that there are going to be too many people, there wasn't going to be enough food, everyone was going to starve. So Peter Singer, writing in the 1970s, feels like he has to address that. So he says, well, okay, but like giving food to people so they don't starve, like saying like that's a problem because it just contributes to overpopulation, it doesn't seem like the best way to control too many people is to not give them food. It says the best means of preventing famine in the long run is population control. So, give people birth control, like give them the right to like choose when to have children, like encourage them not to have children. Don't starve them. It says like it would then follow from the position reached earlier that one ought to be doing all one can to promote population control. Thus, one held that all forms of population control were wrong in themselves or would have significantly bad consequences. Since there are organizations working specifically for population control, one would then support them rather than more orthodox methods of preventing famine. So he says, if you think that, if you give people food now, they're just going to starve in the future, well, then fine. Just give money to people who would, provide birth control and whatever, and don't give money to, don't give food directly. But you're still not allowed to do anything at all, or to do nothing at all. You're not allowed to just like sit on your butt and be like, yeah, I refuse to do anything. All right. Finally, well, how much should we give away? He says, I'm not quite sure. Basically, give as much as you can. He says, I understand that the economy runs on people buying stuff, people buying new clothes and whatever, and it doesn't run on people giving stuff away. We need to think about how much exactly we would give away, because we don't want to tank the economy, we don't want to destroy it. But again, like Peter Singer being Peter Singer, he's like, maybe we should just be giving away 50% of everything that we make. Like, maybe it should just be half our income. So, his view of, like, let's be moderate and consider the economy is probably not the same as, like, an economist. He's like, yeah, sure, 50%. We'll only spend, like, 50% as much as we used to on new clothes and fancy stuff. All right. And then his conclusion is pretty much, it's an interesting conclusion. He says, I'm not saying this as an academic argument. He says, I'm not saying this as something you should go talk about to your professors or whatever, or you should write an article about. He's saying, I am saying these are things that you should do starting right now. He says, this is not like an academic argument like the one Thomas Aquinas made. This is something that matters. This is something you should be doing. He says philosophers need to be the first ones to do this. You will be the first one to read this piece. You will be the first one to understand what I'm saying. So you need to be the first one to be giving to charity. You're not allowed to sit around and argue about this for years and years. Just do it. Just go out there and do things. All right. We're done. So that's Peter Singer's whole argument here. Before we go into my feelings about the piece, did everyone understand? All right. Awesome. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go over my feelings about the piece. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to try to have some sort of class discussion. Because I think what's really interesting about Peter Singer is the reactions he provokes in you. And I feel like you have a lot to think about. And a lot to say. So let me go over what I think, my immediate reactions, and then you can go over, and then you can, sort of type in the chat box what you think, and we'll see if we can have a discussion. Okay? Cool. So, let's go over my feelings. So, normally I wouldn't do this. I don't devote an entire section of a presentation to someone else's argument. Like, it seems a little, well, it seems not. It seems like not quite what we should be doing. But I think when someone presents a moral challenge like this, you really have to grapple with it. And I think that's the point. Is the point is it's supposed to, you either disagree with him or you go out and do what he says. Either way, like, you can't, if you agree with him, like, you're going to have to change your life a lot. So let's go over this. Okay. So first of all, Bangladesh's population in 1970, right before the famine, was 66 million. Their population in 2013 was 156 million. So, you know, if we think about the famine as affecting long-term population growth, it doesn't seem to. I mean, population almost tripled, right? However, I think it's still, you still can't deny that there is human suffering. Like, I don't know if you've ever been, like, starving. I've never been starving to the extent it affected my health, but I've been really hungry and it sucks. And thinking of millions of people all, hungrier than I have ever been or ever will be, I mean, that obviously is a bad thing. So, you still think he does have some sort of point. This is, by the way, speaking of all the people in Bangladesh, this is a festival in Dhaka, which is the capital city of Bangladesh. And, yeah, there are a lot of people. All right. What else do I think? I don't really buy Peter Singer saying that, I'm just choosing this as like an example because it just seems like what I'm reading in the news, whatever. I don't think so. I think he saw something interesting. It was like famine and power and politics and whatever. And I think he chose that and wrote about it. And like when he makes these arguments about like you should be giving, why not give to Bengal? I think there is something to be said about like, well, why not give to people, in your streets? Like, here's a picture of a homeless guy. In Boston, there are homeless people everywhere. Like, why not give to them? Like, why is he focusing on Bengal? And again, I'm not saying that he's wrong that there was suffering happening in Bengal, but it does seem weird to me that he would focus on that suffering instead of the less interesting suffering that was happening, probably a mile away from where he was sitting when writing this. But again, that's just saying we need to redirect our focus, but it still doesn't, defeat his argument. There still was something that was, people were suffering, and, and people are still suffering. And there's a question of, should we be doing something about it, and should we be doing a lot more about it? Well, let's continue. In terms of what to do about it, again, I don't quite buy what Peter Singer says. He's like, give all this money to Bengal relief, whatever. But, like, giving money to other countries doesn't work as well as we would hope. So, for instance, since Bangladesh has become mostly capitalist, they've sort of done a lot better than they ever did when it was just wealthy countries giving them money directly, instead of, wealthy countries buying clothes from them. Their economic growth has been 5 to 6% a year since 1974, which is, a fair amount, not like same level as like China, but it's a fair amount. Their life expectancy has risen from 47 years to 70 years. Again, like that's a lot. Meanwhile, if you think of countries which aren't capitalist, like I use Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is a country in Africa, which gets a lot of foreign aid, has a ton of political problems, has almost no economy. Well, not almost no economy, but a very small economy. Their life expectancy has only increased from 44 to 49 years, even though they get $5 billion a year in aid. Their entire GDP is $15 billion. So they get $5 billion a year. 1/3 of their GDP is aid. And that really hasn't helped them that much. So we have to think about, are we really serving people in the long run if we're just sending money overseas? However, we do get the point where, like, all of this does seem sort of quibbling, right? It's like, maybe we should have a different focus, maybe we should do things differently. But in terms of the actual point of it, of like, we're not doing enough. There is suffering and we are not doing much to help it. Like, still, it's very easy to come up with examples where we know what we could be doing could be so much more, right? Like, we could provide schooling for poor children. Like, in whatever city you live in, I'm sure there are poor children who would love to have the money for, school. And, like, I would just be giving them the same advantages that our parents gave us. My parents sacrificed to send me to good schools. I'm sure your parents sacrificed to send you to good schools. Why shouldn't we be giving way more money so poor kids can go to schools? Well, by the way, this is apparently something called the Green Kids Club. I have no idea what it is. But, it's a bunch of cute kids in school. I have no idea what city in China this is. But, they look nice. All right. So here's my main objection to what Peter Singer says. So here's a study I found online. I'll just read it to you guys. It says, ethicists do not appear to behave better. So people who study ethics don't behave better than normal human beings. They say, never once have we found ethicists as a whole behaving better than our comparison group of other professors by any of our planned measures. But neither do they seem to behave worse. So he says, professors who study ethics don't behave better than professors who study anything else. He says they behave no differently from professors of any other sort, logicians, chemists, historians, foreign language instructors. There is nothing different in the way someone acts in real life, whether they're an ethics professor or a chemistry professor. However, they do embrace more stringent moral norms on some issues, especially vegetarianism and charitable donation. They do believe things that are more strict. So, in a survey of professors from 5 U.S. states, we found that 60% of ethicist responders rated regularly eating the meat of mammals somewhere on the morally bad side of a 9-point scale, ranging from very morally bad to very morally good. By contrast, only 19% of non-philosophy professors rated it as bad. All right? So, 60% of ethicists think it's bad to eat meat. 19% of chemistry professors think it's bad to eat meat. Philosophers in general, 45% think it's bad to eat meat. However, when you see whether or not eaten the meat of a mammal at their last evening meal, we found no statistically significant difference in the group's responses. 38% of chemistry professors ate meat at their last meal. 37% of ethicists ate meat at their last meal. So here's, why do I mention this? Well, every ethicist alive today has probably read this essay, and they've read Peter Singer's arguments on vegetarianism. So they've read why it's bad to eat meat. They've read why they should give more to charity. They understand the arguments. They can explain them to anyone. But they don't follow them. They don't do it. And we can even imagine Peter Singer himself. He's saying, yes, it's totally, yes, you should be working extra hours at work. You should be working 20 hours, a day so you can have more money to give to the poor. But I mean, do you really believe that Peter Singer, when he dies, is going to have, $5 in his bank account? Can you really imagine this famous Princeton professor taking up say, an extra job tutoring or working at a McDonald's or whatever, just so he can have a couple extra dollars to give to the poor? And I can't. I can't imagine seeing Peter Singer, working at a McDonald's, and you say, "Hey, Peter Singer, why are you working at a McDonald's?" And he says, "Well, I'm just trying to make a little extra money so I have a little more money to give to the poor." No, he probably has an office and a family and whatever, and he probably does what a normal person does and works a normal number of hours and spends the rest of the time with family. Why does that matter, though? Why does it matter if Peter Singer can actually follow what he says? Well, Socrates, if he was alive today, and you found out that he was really dumb, like if it turned out that like when you had an argument with Socrates, he just could not argue at all, or when you asked him about something, like the way he thought was just totally mixed up, you'd be really disappointed, right? You'd think, why did I even read that guy? Why did I read what he said if it turns out he can't think very well? It seems something wrong, right? In the same way, I think we should be able to expect ethicists to behave better. I think we need to be able to expect the people who've done this, same way we'd expect Socrates to think better than a normal person, we should think ethicists should behave better than a normal person, right? And speaking of this idea of like prescriptivism, right? Every moral statement is something that you should do. I said it's not that interesting when you think about it as like an actual factual statement, right? Suicide is bad. It's not that interesting when you just say, well, when you say that, you really mean you shouldn't commit suicide, because then the counter-argument could that just be, no, that's not what I mean, and then you're in a stupid argument. But if you think about that, of what you should be saying, if you say suicide is bad, it should be saying don't commit suicide. I think it's the same thing here. Like, everything Peter Singer says should be things that he's actually telling you to do. And not just telling you to do, but telling everyone to do. And the only thing he can be telling everyone to do are things they actually are doing, or can make themselves do. If we're making these arguments and no one is actually following them, like, it seems like we've sort of missed the boat somewhere. Something's wrong. So here's my point of view on all of this, to sum up, and then we can actually get some responses going. My idea of ethics, not that you asked, but I'll tell you anyways. My idea of ethics is try to do the right thing. I'm not going to tell you what the right thing to do is. I think you know what it is. I don't think it's worth like arguing about. You should try hard to be good in the same way you try hard to be smart, and you try hard to be pretty, and everything else that benefits you directly. Like, if you spend an hour putting on makeup in the morning, or you spend 2 hours studying in the evening, and that's all things you do so you get ahead in the world, try to spend at least some amount of time also being good. It won't help you get ahead in the world. The world's unfair, and no one really gets that rewarded for being good. But do it anyways, and encourage other people to be good as well. And that's really all I can say. It's not a great philosophical argument, but, sort of, you wonder about how much philosophical arguments can actually do in terms of what you should be doing. Like, I think this maybe isn't great philosophy, but I think it's more achievable. but that's just me. We'll go over other ethicists in different classes and talk about what they think you should do. But that's for another time. For now, we do have a lot of time. I have some questions for discussions. First thing first, I want to get a general idea of what everyone thinks about Peter Singer, about his arguments. Do people, first of all, first question, do people agree with him? Do you agree with him? All right, so we seem to get a fair amount of no's here. Get one a bit. Okay, based on what we said, next question. Based on what we said in class today, what we discussed in class today, will you change the way you act tomorrow? Got 2 yeses. Anyone else? Maybe. All right. You'll think about it. Okay. Might happen unconsciously. All right, that's a little bit of a cop out. It's a little bit of a I won't do it, but maybe I'll accidentally do it. You'll fall into doing the right thing. All right. Cool. And I guess the last thing would be, there's Peter Singer is probably the most controversial professor at Princeton. When he was appointed as a professor, people had a lot of problems with it. People have problems with him every year. They complain about him every year. The only professor who is probably as controversial is this guy named Robbie George, who's a history professor who is actually very opposite. He's very conservative and against a lot of against abortion and against gay marriage and all that. All right. So, do you think that it's right for someone like Peter Singer to be a professor at an important university like Princeton University? All right. Seems like everyone's saying yes. All right. Cool. So, last thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over some questions for discussion. I've come up with some morality questions here. So, thought they might be sort of interesting as long as we're all thinking about morals and what we should do and whatever. So first question is, how do you know when things are good to do? Like what does your internal voice depend on? And the reason why that's interesting is I think that's ultimately how people decide what they will do. You know, these ethicists who've read all these ethical arguments, I think the way they really figure out what they should do is just this voice inside their head that tells us this is bad, this is good. So I think to some extent, it depends on disgust, right? Like if you try to do something and you're like, I don't want to do that. Like that's your first sort of defense. So if you're gonna, I don't know, if you see someone on the street who's like yelling at their elderly grandparent, like you don't even think about why that's bad, right? You just immediately see them yelling at like their elderly grandparent and you're like, that guy's, who would do that? Why would you yell at an old person, right? And I think that's good, but it can lead to contradictions. Like you're okay eating meat, but you don't want to kill an animal, right? You're okay with someone else killing a pig and then you cook it and eat it, and you'd feel really uncomfortable killing the pig yourself. And you can understand how that would be sort of doesn't really make sense in terms of, you know, ethics and logic, but it is pretty common. I don't think it's always just disgust. Like I think maybe there's some sort of food I like, and maybe you would never eat that food, and you're like, that food's gross. I don't know why you would ever like that, but I don't think you'd think I was wrong about it. In the same way, you know, you see me yelling at my elderly grandparent, you're like, that's wrong. You see me eating a gross food, and you're like, well, I'd never do that, but I don't think it's wrong for someone else to do that. All right. But I do have an ethical dilemma for you guys for things that are good and bad. And I think it's interesting because I think when we think about it logically, we think about the end result here, which can lead to some contradictions about what we actually think. So recently, there's this, in the news, there's been this Japanese airbag manufacturer named Takata. And they've caused the deaths of at least 150 people. And the way they did this, and they're the biggest airbag manufacturer in the world, and the way they did this is they used a new chemical for their airbags that was cheaper than the old chemical that they used. You know what airbags are, right? You like get in a crash and like the thing comes up and it like prevents you from hitting the steering wheel. So get in a car crash, right? So they used this new chemical, and it was cheaper than the old chemical, but it was unstable at high temperatures. So if people were driving their cars in a hot climate, it could blow up. And the whole company knew that this switch could result in deaths, including the CEO. They did it anyway for their profits, and it ended up causing the deaths of 150 people, causing the largest car recall in history. It's still going on now. They have to pay all these fines, but nothing else has really happened, right? Certainly the CEO hasn't been prosecuted for murder or put on trial or anything like that, which I think is sort of what would happen in China, maybe, probably not in the US. All right. Let's say something else. What if the CEO of Takata had been offered $100 million, or however much they made by using this cheaper chemical, by Umbrella Corporation, and that's the evil company from a video game called Resident Evil. All right, so he's offered a huge sum of money to sabotage the airbags of 150 people. You know, this evil company comes to the CEO and they say, we need these 150 people killed. So we need you to use this cheap, unstable chemical instead of the normal chemical. And there would have been the same result for both drivers and Takata. Takata makes a ton of money. People die. Okay? And people die by the exact same method. Is that different than what actually happened, where they just used, would your opinion of how bad it was and what punishment the CEO should get be different if he had been given money by someone to kill 150 people like this versus what actually happened where they just did something that they knew was dangerous? Does your opinion change? What do you guys think? Is that a different case or is it the exact same thing? Okay, so we've got one same thing. One is saying it's a business accident, and the second one is murder. So even if we get same result and the same purpose, they want to make money, so they're willing to do something that can result in death. The difference is whether they're doing it to kill someone or they're just doing it to make money. Is that what the different people are saying? All right. A category of unconventional crime. So yeah, it's certainly true that that would be different. One's commonplace and the other one is rare, right? And of course, according to someone like Peter Singer, he would say it's the same thing. He's just caring about the consequences. He's just caring about what happens to people. He sees people dying, and he's like, yeah, it's the same thing. Okay. Well, next thing to think about. So here's a more broad one. So should moral statements be universal? So Peter Singer's argument depends on this idea that all moral statements are universal. So what's wrong for me is wrong for you is wrong for the guy next to me, right? What's good for me is good for you is good for the guy next to me. Anything we say that someone should do, we're saying that everyone should do. And that first started with this guy named Kant, who we'll cover in another class, who's like one of the great philosophers of Western history. Subjectivists, people who say that, they say no. They say you have to consider the context, you have to consider the person before you say what's right and what's wrong. So, for instance, they said you might think if a Chinese mother calls her daughter fat, that's fine. Like, that's just a thing that Chinese mothers do. They say, hey, it looks like you put on some weight. If Westerners call their daughter fat, a lot of Westerners would think that's a terrible thing for a mom to do. And they'd say, well, what if the kid develops an eating disorder? Like, what if they're makes their daughter very unhappy? Like that, for a lot of Westerners, that'd be a very mean and cruel thing for a mom to do. So, is that a universal statement? More importantly, can I tell my Western friend not to call her daughter fat and tell my Chinese friend that it's okay to call her daughter fat? Is that okay? Okay. So I have another question. So it sounds like we're saying we have to consider cultural backgrounds and whatever. So it's okay to say that. What if I told you that in Massachusetts, where I live right now, part of the culture is say it's okay to kill a baby. Like the whole state has said, we agree with Peter Singer's argument about killing babies, so we kill our babies. We don't think so then, I have, I have a Western friend. She's a mom. She's a mom in Massachusetts. She wants to kill her baby. I'm like, yeah, okay, fine. I understand people in your culture do that. But then I tell my Chinese friend, you can't kill your baby. That's not okay in China. Do you think that's okay? I'm not talking about abortion. I mean like a literal baby, like a baby you can hold in your arms. Killing a baby like that. That's that's what Peter Singer thinks is okay. Okay, so we're saying there are some things which we're okay with saying it's cultural context, like a Chinese mother saying that her daughter is looking fat. We're saying that's okay, but a Western mother calling her daughter fat, that's not okay. And we can say both of those are sort of cultural things. That's fine, but at some point we do draw the line, right? And we have to think about where exactly we are drawing the line here, of why some things are okay to say it varies from culture to culture, other things not so okay. And I guess my last question then would be, can we say, if we don't have a logical argument, if we can't say for sure, why for instance it's wrong to kill a person who's mentally disabled or a baby, but it's okay to kill a pig, or if we can't say for sure why it's okay for a Chinese mother to call her daughter fat and a Western mother not to, but it would be wrong for both of them to kill a baby. So we're saying there are these beliefs we have which we're very sure about, but we can't quite come up with an argument for why. Should those beliefs still be considered valid? do we need to defend things like this in order for us to like take action? Like, in order for us to be able to say, if you saw someone about to kill a baby, do you have to be able to defend it in order to say that it's wrong? Or is it okay to say it's wrong, I don't know why it's wrong, but I'm still going to fight for it? Yeah. So exactly. So Peter Singer, right? He has this pretty good argument about why it's okay to kill a baby, not okay to kill a pig. You know, for us normal people, we don't have those arguments because we probably haven't thought about it that much. We just automatically feel it. Does that mean that if you saw Peter Singer about to kill a baby, would you feel like he's thought about this a lot, so I'm not going to stop him? Or would you say, I don't know, I know he has a better argument than I do, but I'm still going to stop him because I know it's wrong, even if I can't explain why? So you'd stop Peter Singer even if you couldn't explain why you were stopping him. I mean, it certainly is against the Bible, and that is one of the arguments that people bring up. So, you know, maybe you do have an argument. According to Peter Singer, you can just kill a kid. Like, he says that's okay. He has an entire, you know, argument devoted to it. He's very smart. He's thought about it a lot. You know, I know I don't know if I'd be able to like defeat him in a public argument if we, you know, had a debate in front of an audience. I don't know if I could beat him and convince the audience that it's wrong to kill a kid and he might win. So, I mean, does that mean that his ethics are somehow better than mine? Because if they are, then I shouldn't stop him from killing a baby, for instance. All right. Well, we're almost out of time. The last question, um, which I won't ask, I'll just give it to you guys to think about, is if nobody involved thinks that an action harmed them, can it still be unethical? Um, so, for instance, um, homosexuality is something that for a very long time in many different cultures has had people who support it, people who are against it. In some places, it's still punishable by death. Not because either of the people involved in it, either of the adults involved in it, think that it's wrong, but because other people think that it's wrong. And, you know, what you may think of that depends. And there are other questions which are divisive even still. Like there was a Harvard professor who I forget his name, but he gave a lecture series in China where he asked the question, if there was a very rich guy who needed a liver or a heart or a brain, something that was like important and you would die without it, and he was going around offering money to poor people, say like $1 million to some poor person in China, for them to give him his liver, would that be okay? Like the poor person's not going to be forced to give him the liver. The poor person can take the money or not take the money. And presumably if he takes the money, the rich guy is happy and the poor guy is happy, even if the poor guy dies. So is that wrong for a rich guy to do that? So we can't cover that right now, but it is interesting food for thought. In the meanwhile, yes. All right, cool. Here I am. I hope you guys enjoyed today's lecture. I hope you guys will think about it. Perhaps change the way you think, the way you act. I think these sorts of things do have a... thank you. I think these sorts of things do have an impact. As I mentioned, there is at Princeton, Peter Singer's class is sort of famous for making people become vegetarians, or at least for a little while. I don't know. Think about how you might how it might affect your views on charity. Are you giving everything that you could to people? Are you giving as much as you should? It's an interesting question, and I think that's, in my mind, that's ultimately what makes Peter Singer really valuable. Is not necessarily whether you agree with him, whether you disagree with him, but the way he makes you think about how you've been living your life. So, yeah. All right, cool. Oh, by the way, it's not quite ready yet, but something I'll be setting up soon is a community page for this class, so we can all talk in between lessons. You guys can ask questions, discuss with each other. I'm setting it up on an American website, which is good for this sort of stuff. So hopefully that should be coming out in the next couple days, and then you guys will have a good place to discuss philosophy and ethics and whatever else you want to discuss with each other. So be on the lookout for that, and I'll see you in a bit. Bye-bye.